Okay, so this morning we're going to look at medieval art, and I thought we would go ahead and click to the first one. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the Merovingian looped fibula. You guys have probably read about a lot of this art, but I found some cool stuff that when I checked with Khan and other things, they didn't have that. So one way to help you remember both of these images is look for the fibula on which mosaic would you say this is from? Justinian from San Vitale. Excellent. And do you see a fibula anywhere in there? Right there.
Also, is the one on Justinian, is that one? Or?
That one is very nicely elaborate and decorated. So it's kind of a cool way to connect those two. Okay, next slide. All right, so have any of you, let's go ahead and click on that link. And let's take a look and see what we get there. Okay.
In the Middle Ages, parchment was used to make the pages of books. Parchment was made from the skins of animals. The transition from a fresh skin to a surface suitable for writing was a slow and laborious process. The parchment maker selected skins of sheep, goats, or calves. Skins were soaked in lime water for 3 to 10 days to loosen the animal's hair. The parchment maker then scraped away the hair and any remaining flesh. After this, the skin was soaked in fresh water to remove the lime and then stretched tightly on a frame. A special rounded knife was used to scrape the hide to the desired thickness. The process of scraping continued over the course of several days. During this time, the parchment maker continually tightened the tension on the stretching frame while the skin dried. The result was parchment, a smooth and durable material that could last over 1,000 years. Before parchment could be written on, it had to be specially prepared. First, the parchment was rubbed with pumice powder to roughen the surface, and then dusted with a sticky powder. These steps made the surface receptive to inks and colors. The whole finished skin was then cut down to the size of the pages needed for a particular book. A big manuscript was assembled from sheets almost as large as a single skin. For smaller books, the skin was cut into 2 or more pieces. The parchment sheets were folded and nested to make gatherings, usually of 16 or 20 pages. The vibrant illuminations in a medieval manuscript often overshadow the words on the page, yet the writing of the script was as important as the painting of the images. The tools of a scribe, the person who copied the text onto the page, were simple. Pens, called quills, were made from the feathers of a bird, which were soaked in water, dried, and hardened with heated sand. The scribe carved the quill to a rough point, cut a slit to draw ink down, then trimmed the point to the proper width. The shape of the quill point varied with the style of the lettering being copied. Scribes made ink from a variety of materials. Gallnuts, growths found on oak trees, were often used to create a dark black ink. Black ink was also made by dissolving a common carbon substance. The resulting ink was called lampblack. Before the scribe began writing, he ruled the parchment using a straight edge. Medieval scribes and their patrons prized a regular and elegant script. If a scribe made an error, he would scratch it out with a penknife. Because the page was made from parchment, which was very resilient, it could stand many erasures of this type. An illuminator decorated the pages of the manuscript using paint and precious metals. He began only after a scribe had finished copying the text. The illuminator first sketched his design, then added details, such as the features of a figure or the interlacing of a decorated initial. Thin sheets of precious metals, like gold leaf, were always applied first. The illuminator put down a base coat consisting of either a plaster-like substance called gesso or a gum, as shown here. Once the gum base dried, the moisture in the illuminator's breath was enough to make the small piece of gold leaf stick to the page. Then the illuminator brushed away the excess and polished the gold leaf. After applying the gold leaf, the illuminator painted his design. Each color was made from a vegetable dye or a mineral substance ground up and dissolved in liquid. The illuminator applied the paler shades first, then the darker tones. Once the illuminator applied black outlines and delicate white highlights to the figures and vines, the illumination was finished. After the scribes and illuminators had finished writing and decorating the parchment pages, the manuscript was bound. Groups of folded sheets of parchment, called gatherings, were sewn together with strong linen thread onto flexible supports, such as these narrow leather thongs. Next, the binder attached end bands, which secured the top and bottom ends of the pages in the spine of the book. The binder then laced the leather thongs along the spine through channels and tunnels, which had been carved into wood boards. These boards were the covers of the manuscript. The thongs could be held in place by wood pegs or iron nails. The volume was then covered, usually with leather. Without pressure from the covers to keep the leaves flat, parchment expanded and contracted with changes in temperature and humidity. Pressure was applied by the addition of clasps or straps, which held the book closed. The binding of a manuscript could be decorated with any one of a variety of materials. A manuscript might be covered with leather, stamped or tooled with gold, or covered with silks or velvets. The most elaborate bindings received sculpted decoration made from precious metals. The materials of the binding depended on the wealth of the patron, the type of manuscript, and its intended use.
Okay. Ethan, if you want to come down. All right, so how many of you have done some of the reading in the textbook? Insular art. Did any of you read about that? Okay. So insular or Hiberno-Saxon art is works produced in the British Isles between 500 and 900 CE. Good idea to remember that. Anybody recognize this? What is it? Huh? Yes, and that would be the carpet page. So you can see the elaborate detail, and I love that parchment video because it really shows you the meticulous steps that were taken to make a page, not just from the parchment point of view, but also, you know, the design and the art. Okay, so next one. All right, so interlace. It's a decorative element found in medieval art, usually from the British Isles, although not totally restricted to there. In interlace, bands or portions of other motifs are looped, braided, and knotted in complex geometric patterns, often to fill a space. So you can see here, and it's used mostly on insular manuscripts. So you can see here, we've got this knotted pattern. All of you should hopefully be familiar with something called a Celtic knot. That very much was indigenous to the British Isles, although Coptic art from Egypt was also had interlace in it. It's very elaborate, and to me it's gorgeous. Okay, so and you can see here once more on interlace. Our textbook says that painting such elaborate designs was an exercise in patience, as demanding as more physically strenuous feats of endurance that monks imposed on themselves for the benefit of their souls. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because when you look at that, I don't know how many of you are artists, but this is so much work and it takes so much patience that I can see that, a lot of them felt that it was good for their soul to be spending their time hunched over, and they can only do it certain hours of the day, depending on the light. Okay, next. So the other contribution of the Insular Manuscript Illuminators was the elaboration of capital letters into configurations of labyrinthine complexity. Be proud of me, I said that first thing in the morning. So, the illuminated or the decorated capital letters, as well as the, lacing and intertwined lines was very much a part of the Insular or the Hiberno-Saxon locations. All right, moving on to the next one. So, what we're looking at is most of the art that we're studying is what kind of art? Anybody have any stab? It's telling stories. So it would be narrative. Excellent. So here we have another example of narrative. So we have the dedication page with Blanche of Castile and King Louis IX of France, Roman letters in the morning. Scenes from the Apocalypse from the Bible Morales, Gothic Europe, and beautiful stuff. Okay, we're going to watch that. So click that link. You can stay there if you want.
The Bible of St. Louis is a 3-volume illuminated manuscript, painted in Paris between 1226 and 1234. Since the times of King Alfonso X the Wise, this Bible has been housed at the Primate Cathedral in Toledo, apart from 8 folios to be found at the Morgan Library and Museum, New York. Considered to be the finest and most ambitious pictorial representation in the history of painting and writing, the Bible of St. Louis was commissioned by Blanche of Castile, Queen of France, for the Christian education of her son Louis IX of France. St. Louis, the 800th anniversary of whose birth is precisely 2014. The Codex consists of 4,887 illuminated historiated scenes, 8 per page, of a quality and quantity unrivaled in the history of illumination. This enormous collection of miniatures constitutes the largest graphic catalogue of the Middle Ages, a gallery in book form offering countless examples of medieval beliefs, garments, customs. The Bible of St. Louis is a mirror of 13th century France that reflects, for example, the religious conflicts of that period between Christians, Jews, Catars, and Saracens. As regards linguistic considerations, the text of this Bible is in Latin, although a part of it is also written in French. This codex is a Bible moralisé, a type of biblical book lavishly illuminated in an obvious display of wealth and splendor, whose scenes are usually depicted inside medallions. The famous medallions in this particular Bible were obviously the inspiration for the stained glass windows in the mythical Sainte-Chapelle, Paris. This Bible begins with a spectacular frontispiece, consisting of a full-page image of the Creator holding an orb and surrounded by 4 angels. The colophon features Blanche of Castile, who commissioned the Codex, and St. Louis, the intended recipient, at the top. The bottom of the colophon features the religious who designed the Codex and a lay craftsman who made it. One of those who helped make the Codex must have portrayed himself following the instructions of the religious responsible for managing the team of artists. It is not possible to identify the specific order to which the religious belongs from his garments. The outcome of the work by these artists, the Bible of St. Louis, is deemed to be the greatest bibliographic monument of universal culture. The edition of the Bible of St. Louis produced by M. Molero, editor, is unique, unrepeatable, and the first of its kind. This strictly limited edition of 987 is numbered and certified copies by Notary Public. This
Hope that you'll now buy a copy of this, which yeah. So we're kind of going somewhat quickly through these illuminating manuscripts, so I want to get to the Bayeux Tapestry today. Okay, so the literal meaning of the Hebrew word Haggadah is a narration or telling, and it refers to a command in the biblical book of Exodus requiring Jews to tell your son on that day, "It is because of that which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt." Okay. What do we have next? Okay. Then we look at the narratives that Giotto did in the Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy. Unknown architect, but Giotto was the architect, and you can see that it's done in fresco. Fresco, as a reminder, is paint, fresh paint put on damp plaster, and the combination, the chemical combination, makes the color last for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years. We've seen that in Pompeii and other places. Notice that there wasn't really money to put a lot of jewels or gems in this, or even marble, and so a lot of this was done by Giotto, or artists through his workshop, to make it look like there was gemstones embedded in the wall as well as the marbling. Okay, next one. These are the earliest that have been authenticated as being painted by Giotto. And what makes his narrative so interesting is the range of emotion that you can start seeing in their faces. Each figure is individually and uniquely expressed. Okay, now, so you're done here. So we're going to take a look at a couple of these things. The Bayeux Tapestry. So this is pretty cool, animated. It translated for us. Pretty gruesome. Okay, this guy's got some cool stuff to say.
The Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most famous works of art from the European Middle Ages, was made to commemorate the Norman invasion of England in 1066. The aged King Edward died without heir, leaving a contested succession. There were two claimants, one an Englishman named Harold, and the other William, Duke of Normandy, with about 6,000 soldiers. William, the Duke of the Normans, came to England to exercise what he said was his legitimate right to be the King of England. Not only does it depict political and military affairs rather than the lives of saints or scenes from the Bible, it depicts one of the turning points in all of European history. What we now believe, on much evidence, is that the master designer and the embroiderers were English. So here we have a paradox of the conquered commissioning the conquered people to commemorate a victory over the English, a victory which meant the loss of their property, the loss of their independence, and having moved overlords from France. The fact that the English made the tapestry raises many interesting questions about whether or not the English were including an alternative narrative to that which was being promoted by the Norman propagandists. One example is that when Harold, the English claimant, is shown in the tapestry, he is always identified as Harold the King, Harold Rex, whereas the Normans described him in their written propaganda accounts as Harold the Usurper, Harold the Tyrant. In the borders, sometimes we have animals telling stories from the fables of Aesop. Aesop was a slave, and he wrote his animal stories as a way of criticizing those who were more powerful. The fact that the English designers include many Aesopic fables raises the question of whether or not we have a counter-narrative to the themes that justify William in claiming the English throne.
One more.
This is the Bayeux Tapestry. It was commissioned to celebrate William's conquest of England, and it begins with the events that led up to it. The death of Edward the Confessor, King of England, and the succession of a new king, Harold. It's magical to be taken back 1,000 years in this dark chamber to see history spelt out for you. 70 meters long, right down to the end, right round to the back. And the story very vividly told. But at the same time, along the friezes, top and bottom, wonderfully vivid pictures. Some of them of Aesop's fables, some of little stories, some nobody knows what they are. Little details of farming life here. Ploughing, sowing, and a man killing birds with a sling. It's not, strictly speaking, a tapestry. It's actually needlework, sewn with wool onto linen. I suppose the story that we know best begins with the death of Edward the Confessor and his burial in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey here with the hand of God blessing it, and here Harold receiving the crown, his orb and his scepter, people looking on, and then spies come across and explain to William in Normandy what's happened in England, that Harold has seized the crown, and here he orders ships to be built for an invasion. So the first thing to cut down the trees and start building the ships, putting aboard suits of chainmail, needing 2 men to carry them, and spears, arrows. And the last stage is to get the horses on board these long ships. Very tricky, and they don't look particularly happy. The boats set sail, they cross over to Pevensey, land safely at Pevensey, go ashore, and then the real task begins. But first, the army has to be fed. There's a tureen there being boiled. There's some chicken kebabs, they look like. And here William feasting with his men. And then they're preparing for war. They build a castle of wood at Hastings. William's followers set light to some of the Anglo-Saxon houses. A woman leading her child away from her burning house. And then battle commences. Quite slowly to start with the cavalry charging against Harold's forces. Heads chopped off, hands chopped off, and the battle rages all day long. In the confusion of the battle, as swords and axes clang against shields, a dangerous rumor sweeps William's army that he has been killed. So what does he do? He turns around in his saddle, lifts his helmet off, and shows himself to his troops. And the battle goes on. And then we come to the famous design of Harold with the arrow in his eye. Nobody quite knows whether that is what happened. And here, slaughtered. I've seen this many times. Every time I see it, I have to say, it just brings the whole story of William's invasion of England alive. You rarely feel here, because this was done by people living only a few years after the event, you rarely feel the power and the passion that went into it. It's a completely magical work of art.
So basically, this was done also in part because a lot of people were illiterate. In order to tell this story, they had to find a way to do it. Yes, there's Latin in it, but there's also some really cool artistic things that they have used. Ornamental animals that decorate and reflect the events of the main story. And you can see from the body language, gives you a sense of each character, what they're doing, how they're feeling. You know, a timid captive or a timid servant. Then we've got contrast, light and dark areas draw the eye to important characters. And then the hair and clothing indicate the ethnicity. So the English, can't read that. And the Normans had the shaved back of the head, as well as the social status. And then captions. Clear text explains the names and the major events. So we have the text, yeah, okay. And then over here we have some building, environment, and furniture, and it shows details about how people lived and traveled and were sheltered. The size of the character obviously stands for importance. We already know about the hierarchy of scale. Then we've got ornamental dividers, trees that break up the story into sequences of scenes or panels or registers. And then informational ornamentation, showing details about life, including work, sports, food production, scandals, myths, and fables. And then empty space that will give a character or a gesture added importance. So this is a really important piece of art that I think is really important that you know really well, because of the fact that it shows so much, not just a major turning point. Is reminiscent of the Alexander mosaic in the sense that it's depicting a major turning point in history. Obviously, they didn't do it as succinctly or briefly as the artist who did the mosaic for the Alexander mosaic. But nonetheless, we can see how people were dressed, how they looked. And you can see it reads from left to right, which means that's where we learn to do that. So, you know, it is also a narrative so that anybody, whether they're able to read or not, who is who and what is happening. And I like the point that the British commentator made about the fact that this was done by the people who were conquered. And so, including these various fables, were they actually kind of thumbing their nose at the Normans? It's an interesting thought to think about. So, you guys have the rest of the block to work. I need to come around and see snapshots and flashcards that have not been checked off. And then we will pick up tomorrow where we left off. Any questions on any of this information? Everybody's as happy as can be with their